One king claimed to rule all Britain. 5 armies gathered to prove him wrong. On a blood-soaked field whose name would echo through the ages, the fate of England itself hung in the balance. Autumn mist clung to the northern hills like a burial shroud. The year was 937, and across a stretch of land whose exact name has been lost to time, though men would call it Brunanburh, 2 armies stirred in the grey light before dawn. On one side, beneath banners bearing the golden dragon of Wessex, stood the English. 20,000 men, perhaps more, drawn from every corner of a realm that had never before been truly one. Their king was young, barely 40, but his name already carried weight that made distant thrones tremble. Æthelstan, king of the English, lord of Britain, grandson of Alfred the Great. Across the field, the banners told a different story. The raven of the Norse, the lion of Scotland, the ancient emblems of Strathclyde. This was no single army, but a coalition of vengeance. Vikings from Dublin, Scots from Alba, Britain from the old kingdoms of the north. They had come together for a single purpose, to shatter English power before it consumed them all. Their numbers matched Æthelstan's, perhaps exceeded them. Their fury certainly did. Between these 2 hosts, the morning waited. No one knew it yet. But what happened in the next 12 hours would determine whether England would survive as a unified kingdom, or collapse back into the wearing fragments from which it had been forged. This was not a border raid. This was not a dynastic squabble. This was the collision of 2 visions of Britain, and only one would walk away from this field. The drums began to beat, the sun broke through the mist, and the day that would birth a nation began. To understand why 5 armies gathered on that autumn morning, you must understand what Æthelstan had done, and why so many wanted him dead for it. For centuries, the island the Romans called Britannia had been a patchwork of warring kingdoms. Anglo, Saxons held the south and east. Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria. Vikings controlled the Danelaw and Dublin. The Scots ruled Alba in the north. The Britons clung to Wales and Strathclyde. The Picts had their strongholds. No king ruled more than a fraction of the whole, and the idea of a single kingdom of England was a dream at best, a dangerous delusion at worst. Then came Ethel, born in the 890s. He was the son of Edward the Elder and grandson of Alfred the Great, the man who had saved Wessex from annihilation and turned it into the strongest Saxon kingdom. But Alfred and Edward had been content to rule their portion and defend their borders. Æthelstan wanted more. He wanted what no man had achieved in 400 years. He wanted all of England under one crown, and by God and iron he took it. When he claimed his throne in 924, Ethel moved with a speed and ruthlessness that shocked his enemies. He absorbed Mercia. He conquered Northumbria, the last Viking kingdom in England. He drove the Norse kings back across the Irish Sea. He forced the Welsh princes to submit, made them pay tribute, and established his border at the Wye. By 927, he styled himself King of the English, and meant it literally. For the first time since the Romans left, one man ruled from the Channel to the Scottish border, but power always breeds enemies, and Ætheltan had made them all. Constantine II of Scotland watched this English expansion with growing alarm. He was an old man now, weathered by decades of war, and he knew what happened to kings who ignored threats until they sat on their borders. Ethel had already forced him into a humiliating submission ceremony at Amont Bridge, where Constantine had to acknowledge English overlordship. The Scottish king had knelt. He had sworn oaths, but in the privacy of his own halls he seethed. England's reach was growing too long, its king too ambitious. If Æthelstan were allowed to consolidate, Scotland would be next, not as a rival, but as a province. Across the Irish Sea, another king nursed his own bitter grievances. Olaf Guthrudsson, young king of Dublin, grandson of the great Ivar the Boneless, had watched Æthelstan destroy every Viking kingdom in Britain. York had fallen, the Danelaw had submitted. The Norse, who had ruled northern England for generations, were scattered or dead. For Olaf, this was not just politics, this was survival. If England remained united and strong, there would be no place left for the Norse in Britain. The age of Viking kings would end, crushed beneath English banners and English law. And in Strathclyde, Owain, king of the Britons, saw his own future written in Ethel's conquests. The English had taken Northumbria, they controlled Wales, Strathclyde was surrounded, a Celtic island in an English sea. If the English king decided to finish what he had started, there would be nowhere to run. 3 kings, 3 peoples, 3 separate hatreds, but one shared enemy. In 937, they made a pact. Constantine of Scotland would march south with his warriors, grizzled veterans who had fought the Norse for decades and knew how to hold a shield wall. Olaf of Dublin would cross from Ireland with his Vikings, young hungry raiders eager to reclaim what their fathers had lost. Owain of Strathclyde would join them with his Britain. Together they would outnumber Æthelstan. Together they would invade England from the north. Together they would destroy the English king and divide his realm among themselves like meat from a carcass. It was the greatest coalition ever assembled against England. If it succeeded, Æthelstan's unified kingdom would die with him. If it failed, there would be no one left to stop England's rise. Æthelstan received word of the invasion in the summer of 937. The coalition was gathering in the north near the Scottish border, preparing to march south. Their intent was clear: strike deep to Ethel's heartland before he could fully mobilize, burn, plunder, and force him into a battle where numbers would tell. The English king did not hesitate. He called his banners from Wessex, from Mercia, from East Anglia, from conquered Northumbria. The warriors came. Lords and THS, husks and ferdmen, men who spoke different dialects and had fought each other in living memory, but who now served one king. Ethan had spent 13 years forging England. He would not watch it torn apart by foreign armies without bleeding them dry first. He marched north with his brother Edmund at his side, a young man barely 20, but already a tested warrior in Ethan's heir. They moved quickly, gathering strength as they went, determined to meet the coalition before it could ravage the Midlands. Somewhere in the north the 2 armies collided. The exact location has been debated for 1,000 years. Bromere on the Wirral, the banks of the Humber, the moors of Northumbria, but the name that survived was Brunanburh, a field, a valley, perhaps a ford, a place whose geography mattered far less than what happened there. By late summer or early autumn of 937, both armies were in position. The coalition, confident in their numbers and the righteousness of their cause, prepared to sweep the English from the field. Ethel, knowing that everything he had built could die in the next 12 hours, prepared his men to hold the line. Neither side wanted a negotiated peace. Neither side believed compromise was possible. This was a fight to the finish, and the losers would not be writing the history. Let me detail how both sides prepared the terrain, the strategic choices, and build the tension before the battle. The coalition arrived first. Constantine, Olaf, and Owain chose their ground carefully. They needed a position that would allow their superior numbers to deploy fully, where the English could not use narrow terrain to negate the coalition's advantage. They found it, an open stretch of land wide enough for thousands of men to form lines with gentle slopes that would allow their warriors to see the enemy clearly as they advanced. For the Scots and Strathclyde Briton, this was familiar ground, northern country, cool and damp, even in late summer, where the wind carried the smell of heather and peat. For Olaf's Dublin Vikings, it was less familiar, but they did not care. They had crossed the Irish Sea for vengeance, and they would have it on any ground England offered. The coalition commanders held council the night before battle. Constantine, the eldest and most experienced, argued for patience. Let the English come to them. Let Æthelstan's men tire themselves climbing the slope. Olaf, younger and more aggressive, wanted to attack at first light, to use the coalition's numbers to overwhelm the English shield wall before it could properly form. Owain, caught between the two, urged unity above all else. They had come this far together. They could not afford to splinter now. In the end, they agreed on a simple plan: form a massive battle line, let Æthelstan's army exhaust itself in the initial clash, then use their superior numbers to flank and envelop the English. It was not subtle, but it did not need to be. They had more warriors. They had more rage. That would be enough. Across the field, Ethel faced a different challenge. His army was unified in name, but not in blood. The men of Wessex fought shoulder to shoulder with men of Mercia, who had been enemies a generation ago. Northumbrians stood in the ranks beside the very English warriors who had conquered them. The ferdmen, farmers and craftsmen called up for war, stood beside professional husks who had trained for combat since boyhood. This was the army of a united England, but it had never been tested together, not like this, not against a coalition that outnumbered them and wanted nothing more than to tear England back apart. Ethel made his decision quickly. He would not try to outmaneuver the coalition. He would not seek advantageous terrain or clever ambushes. He would do what English kings had done since Alfred's time: form the shield wall and hold. The English deployed in a deep, dense formation. The center was the strongest, the king's own household troops, the best armed and most experienced warriors in the army, men who had fought for Æthelstan in a dozen campaigns and would die for him if the day demanded it. Edmund, Æthelstan's brother, commanded one wing, trusted ealdorman commanded the other. The ferdmen, less experienced but no less determined, filled the ranks behind the professionals, ready to step forward when the front lines fell. Ethan walked among his men the night before battle. He did not give grand speeches. He did not need to. These warriors knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the kingdom that Ethan had built, the kingdom their fathers and grandfathers had bled to create. They were fighting so that England would not die before it had truly lived. As darkness fell, both camps settled into uneasy rest. Fires flickered across the land like scattered stars. Men sharpened blades, checked straps on shields, and murmured prayers to God or to older gods whose names Christians were not supposed to remember. Some wrote messages for loved ones in case they did not return. Others sat in silence, staring at the distant fires of the enemy camp, wondering how many of those men they would kill tomorrow and how many would kill them. The night was long. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that never came. Sentries paced the lines, watching for any sign of night attack, but none came. Both armies knew that this fight would be settled in daylight, face to face, shield to shield, with no tricks and no mercy. As the first gray light touched the horizon, men began to stir. Commanders bellowed orders, warriors donned mail and helmets, hefted spears and anks, and formed their lines. The coalition arrayed itself across the northern end of the field, a vast mass of humanity bristling with weapons, their banners snapping in the wind. The English formed opposite them, fewer in number, but standing in perfect, unmoving ranks, their shields locked edge to edge, their faces set. Between them, perhaps 500 y.d. of empty ground, grass, stones, patches of mud, ground that would soon be unrecognizable. Æthelstan stood at the center of his line, clearly visible in his royal armor. He wanted his enemies to see him, to know that the king of the English would not hide behind his warriors, but would stand with them, fight with them, and if necessary, die with them. Across the field, Constantine and Olaf saw him and understood. This would not be a battle where kings stayed in the rear and let others do the dying. This would be personal. The sun climbed higher. The wind dropped. The two armies stood in absolute silence, staring at each other across the divide, waiting for the signal that would unleash the storm. Then the horns sounded, the drums began, and 20-0 warriors on each side started forward, moving as one, closing the distance with every step. The Battle of Brunanburh had begun. The collision was not like thunder, it was worse. It was the sound of 20-0 men smashing into 20-0 more. Shields splintering, iron ringing on iron, voices raised in wordless roars that blended into a single overwhelming wave of noise that drowned thought and left only instinct. The coalition struck first. Olaf's Vikings, positioned on the coalition's right flank, surged forward faster than the Scots in the center, eager to close with the enemy and do what Vikings did best, kill. They hit the English left wing like a battering ram, shields forward, axes rising and falling, screaming battle cries in Norse that chilled even veteran warriors' blood. The English line buckled but did not break. Mail-clad Husky locked shields and pushed back, stabbing with spears over the shield rims, dragging down Vikings who pushed too far forward, holding ground because the alternative was death. In the center, the Scots advanced more steadily, their shield wall disciplined and tight. Constantine's warriors were veterans, men who had fought the Norse for decades and survived by being smarter and tougher than the enemy. They did not charge wildly. They marched step by deliberate step, closing the distance with the English center, where Ethel himself stood beneath his banner. The two shield walls met with a crash that echoed across the moorland. For a moment, neither side moved. They simply pushed, shields grinding against shields, men in the front rank gasping for breath in the crush. Unable to step back, unable to move forward, locked in a brutal contest of strength and endurance that had no end except exhaustion or death. Then the killing began in earnest, spears thrust over shield rims, axes hooked over the tops of shields, dragging them down and exposing throats and faces to follow-up blows. Men in the second and third ranks shoved forward, adding their weight to the push, trying to drive the enemy backward 1 inch at a time. Those in the front rank died quickly, crushed by the press of bodies, stabbed by spears they never saw coming, pulled down into the mass where they were trampled and forgotten. But behind every man who fell, another stepped forward, the line held on the English right. Edmund's wing clashed with Owain's Briton. The youngest of the coalition's leaders had brought warriors who fought with a desperate fool, born of knowing that if England survived this day, their kingdom would be next to fall. They hammered the English right with relentless attacks, trying to break through and curl around Æthelstan's flank. Edmund, barely 20 years old but fighting like a man possessed, rallied his warriors again and again, leading countercharges that drove the Britons back, then retreating into defensive positions. When the coalition regrouped and surged forward once more, it was brutal, grinding combat with no elegance and no mercy, just iron and courage and the will to hold one more minute, then another after that. The battle became a nightmare of noise and confusion. Men fought in a fog of dust and blood, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, knowing their comrades only by the colors of their shields and the shapes of their helmets. Commands were impossible to hear over the roar. Warriors fought by instinct, by training, by pure animal survival. When a man fell, his companions did not stop to mourn. They stepped over the body and kept fighting because stopping meant dying. Hours passed, the sun climbed toward noon, neither side had broken, the casualties mounted, hundreds dead, then 1,000, then more. But the lines held. Men who had entered the battle fresh were now gasping for breath, their arms lean, their shields splintered, their mail dented and torn. But they could not stop. The moment either side wavered, the other would pour through the gap and turn the battle into a slaughter. Æthelstan fought in the center of his line. He did not direct the battle from a safe distance. He stood in the shield war with his household troops, his sword reed to the hilt, his voice from shouting encouragement to the men around him. He killed Scots who broke through the front rank. He steadied warriors who faltered. He made himself visible, made himself a target because he knew that if his men saw their king bleeding and fighting beside them, they would not break. Constantine, across the line, did the same. The old Scottish king was past 60, an age when most men were content to sit by fires and tell stories of battles fought in youth. But he stood in the front rank with his warriors, his sword as steady as it had been 40 years earlier. He had spent a lifetime fighting for Scotland's independence. He would not flee now. For a time, it seemed the battle might never end. Neither army could gain an advantage, neither could afford to retreat. They were locked together like two wounded beasts, tearing at each other, but unable to deliver the killing blow. Then, as afternoon wore on, the balance began to shift. The coalition began to crack first. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic break, but slowly, like ice melting under pressure, hairline fractures spreading through the structure until it could no longer hold. On the coalition's right, Olaf's Vikings had been fighting with suicidal fury for hours, throwing themselves at the English left in wave after wave, trying to break through by sheer aggression. But the English line had not broken. The Vikings had taken terrible casualties, Jarls and Hussars lying dead in the mud, their best warriors bleeding out in the grass, and they had nothing to show for it. Worse, the English were not weakening. If anything, they seemed to be getting stronger as fresh warriors from the rear ranks rotated forward to replace the exhausted men in front. The Vikings began to hesitate. Attacks that had been savage and relentless became tentative, probing. Men looked over their shoulders, wondering if perhaps it was time to withdraw and regroup. In the center, the Scots were faring no better. Constantine's shield wall was still intact, but it had been pushed back step by bloody step, yielding ground it could not afford to lose. The English center, anchored by Aethelstan's household troops, had not given an inch. They fought with a discipline that came from years of campaigning together, rotating tired men out, bringing fresh warriors forward, maintaining the integrity of the shield wall even as bodies piled up in front of it. The Scots could match them in courage, but they could not match them in endurance. And on the coalition's left, Owain's Britons were in trouble. Edmund had sensed the weakness there, and had begun pressing harder, committing his reserves in a series of savage counterattacks that drove the Britons back and threatened to turn their flank. Owain tried to rally his men, but they were exhausted, bloodied, and beginning to lose faith that this battle could be won. The coalition had gambled everything on breaking the English in the first hours of combat. They had not broken. And now, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the coalition's armies were bleeding, tiring, and starting to wonder if survival might be more important than victory. Ethel saw it. He saw the Vikings hesitate. He saw the Scots waver. He saw Edmund's wing pushing the Britons back. He knew that if he pressed now, pressed hard, the coalition might shatter. But if he waited too long, if he let them disengage and regroup, they would still have the numbers to try again tomorrow. This had to end now. He raised his sword high and shouted the command that every English warrior had been waiting for. Forward, the English shield wall surged ahead, not a cautious advance, not a careful step-by-step push, but a sudden violent charge that caught the coalition off guard. Men who had been locked in defensive combat for hours suddenly found themselves attacking, driving forward, breaking through weak points in the coalition line, turning the battle from a grinding stalemate into a chaotic melee. The Vikings on the right tried to hold, but Edmund's wing hit them from the side at the same moment, catching them between two English forces. The Viking line disintegrated. Warriors who had fought with unbreakable courage all day suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting for their lives with no hope of victory. Some died where they stood, others began to run. In the center, the Scots felt the pressure intensify. The English were not just pushing now, they were killing with a methodical efficiency that spoke of victory within reach. Warriors began to fall back, not in an organized retreat, but in a panicked withdrawal. The shield wall, which had held for hours, began to fragment. Constantine saw his army breaking and knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. He tried to rally his warriors, tried to form a new line, but the momentum had shifted too far. The English were through the line into the coalition's rear, cutting down men who had turned to run. The retreat became a rout. Owen's Britons were the first to fully break. Seeing the Scots collapsing and the Vikings fleeing, they abandoned the field and ran north, desperate to escape before the English cavalry caught them. Many did not make it. The English pursued with a vengeance, cutting down fleeing warriors, showing no mercy to men who had invaded their kingdom. Olaf Guthruson, the young Viking king from Dublin, fought his way out of the encirclement and fled with what remained of his bodyguard. He had come to England seeking glory and reconquest. He left with a fraction of his army, his dreams shattered, his reputation in ruins. Constantine of Scotland, the old warrior king, retreated in better order but no less defeat. He had lost his son in the battle. Killed in the final English charge, his body left on the field among the thousands of other dead. The Scottish king had risked everything to stop English expansion. He had failed, his army was broken, his son was dead, and Aethelstan's kingdom still stood. The English did not pursue far. They were exhausted, bloodied, and had no desire to chase a broken enemy into the gathering darkness. They had what they needed: victory, total, unambiguous, undeniable victory. As the sun set on the field of Brunn, the English warriors stood among the dead and realized what they had done. They had faced the greatest coalition ever assembled against England, and they had destroyed it. The bodies of thousands of enemies lay scattered across the land. Scots, Vikings, Britons all mingled together in death as they had been in alliance. The coalition had come to shatter England. Instead, England had shattered them. Æthelstan and walked the battlefield as twilight fell, moving among the wounded and the dying, checking on his own warriors, seeing which of his lords and things had survived. His losses had been severe. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of his own men lay dead or dying, but they had held. When the coalition had thrown everything it had at the English line, the line had held, and now the threat was broken. His brother Edmund found him near the center of the field where the fighting had been worst. The young prince was covered in blood, some of it his own, most of it not. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had survived a battle that could have ended everything their grandfather had built. They had not just survived. They had won. Around them, English warriors began the grim work of finding their own dead and preparing them for burial. The coalition's dead would be left for the carrion birds, a message to anyone who thought to challenge England again. The night air filled with the sound of men calling for friends and kinsmen, hoping for an answer, fearing silence. In the darkness, fires were lit, not the campfires of armies preparing for another day of battle, but the pious of the dead. The English burned or buried their own with what honor they could manage on a field that wire of blood and death. The coalition's dead lay where they had fallen, scattered across the moorland in grotesque piles, their weapons broken, their banners trampled into the mud. By morning, the coalition survivors were miles away, running for Scotland, for Strathclyde, for ships that would take them back to Dublin, and the shameful task of explaining to their people how the great invasion had failed. They left behind not just their dead, but their dreams of breaking English power. Æthelstan had proven that England could not be divided, not by superior numbers, not by foreign kings, not by anyone. The king of the English stood on that blood-soaked field and knew that something had changed. His kingdom had been tested as it had never been tested before. His army, drawn from different peoples and different traditions, had fought as one. They had not fought for gold or glory or revenge. They had fought for England, and England had survived. When the sun rose on the day after Brunanburh, it rose on a kingdom that would not fall. The coalition was broken, the enemies were scattered, the Vikings would never again mount a serious challenge to English rule. The Scots would retreat behind their borders and stay there for generations. The age of England had begun, forged in the fire of a single day's battle, paid for in the blood of thousands of men who died believing their cause was just. Ethel gave the order to march south. His army, battered and exhausted but victorious, formed their ranks and began the long journey home. They left behind them a field that would be remembered for 1,000 years, not for its location, which would be lost to history, but for what happened there. For the battle that proved England could endure, for the day when 5 armies tried to destroy a kingdom, and the kingdom destroyed them instead. The banners moved south, the dead remained, and the field of Brunanburh grew silent, holding its secrets, marked only by the carrion birds circling overhead, and the knowledge that here, in this place, England had been born in fire and blood, and would not die easily.